Tensions over Greenland expected to overshadow the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
U.S. President Donald Trump is set to head there today, facing potential confrontations with European allies. The U.S. leader has vowed to hit Europe with tariffs of up to 25% unless Greenland is ceded to America.
EU leaders have vowed to stay firm against Washington's threats. A European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen cautioning that Trump risks plunging U.S. ties with the EU into a, quote, downward spiral. All right, for more, we are joined by Jon Lieber, Managing Director at the Eurasia Group. For more, Jon, so for months we saw EU trying restraint and dialogue with the U.S., but is this the moment they realize that soft approaches won't work with President Trump and that they may need to treat the U.S. more like they would a tough power like, I don't know, China?
Yeah, or Russia, which might be the more appropriate analog here, given what the Trump administration is talking about doing, which is effectively a land grab from Europe. And I think this is a really difficult situation for the Europeans. One pattern we've seen with Donald Trump is that when he thinks he has strength and leverage over any adversary, he pushes until he gets what he wants. And when he thinks he's run up to a power, like he did with China, he backs off. A power that he can't control or one that can push back, he backs off. And I think the Europeans are asking themselves now, what can they do collectively that sends a message to the United States that they can't be bullied, that they can impose costs on the Trump administration and on the United States that are going to become political problems for Donald Trump. And then can they use that power to get him to back off here? And right now, I just don't see it. I think that this probably has to escalate before we can get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that, I mean, European leaders, they're appearing to present a united front, they're calling for unity, but the idea of how to respond to Donald Trump is very unclear, it's very varied. I mean, how real is the prospect then of a common EU strategy? Von der Leyen, she spoke about a new independent Europe, and can it really be such given Europe's reliance on the US for security, trade as well?
Yeah, and it's not just their reliance on the U.S., it's their reliance on each other. So, I think it's notable that countries like Italy have not been part of the joint response that the EU has been mounting over Greenland so far. And there's going to be a lot of other countries on the eastern flank of the EU that don't see this as big of a threat as the core European countries do. So those unity issues are going to present massive problems in their ability to retaliate. I think they probably do end up retaliating should the U.S. put in place the trade measures that it's threatening. Obviously, I think Trump's trying to build up some leverage right now. Otherwise, he would have imposed those tariffs immediately and not waited until the February deadline that he gave the Europeans to react. But so this is a threat that's meant to start a negotiation. And what the Europeans are saying is there is no negotiation here. We can't give up sovereignty over Greenland. And that idea is deeply offensive in all of these European capitals, which is what makes this such a dangerous situation that looks likely to escalate.
And speaking of Mr. Trump, earlier during the presser, he had said that NATO will be very happy with his Greenland plan. What exactly do you think he means by that? And how realistic is it that his allies will see it the same way?
I assume he's talking about defense burden sharing. And if you think about the changes that Trump's been forcing in NATO more broadly, it's about forcing European countries to spend more to meet their own, what he thinks of as their fair share commitments in NATO. And so if you take Greenland and shift it on the map to the United States, out of the European realm of responsibility, now the U.S. is going to be the ones spending money in order to defend Greenland and not Denmark or the rest of the European Union. And I think just from if you're thinking about this just in terms of dollars and cents, yeah, there's logic to that. Making this, Greenland, which is a key security weakness for North America, and there are these bases that the Russians have been forming around the Arctic Circle, and so there are legitimate security concerns here. And if the U.S. is taking on the financial burden of making sure that Greenland is secure, well, in that sense, then it is good news for NATO countries who no longer have to pay for it. But I don't think that's a compelling argument to the Europeans.
Okay, just looking at options that can convince Mr. Trump. Could something like a minerals deal, that's similar to what we've seen floated elsewhere, diffuse tensions, or hardline options like the economic bazooka work better in changing his mind?
I think if you really want to appease Trump, you don't go for a minerals deal, you go for a branding deal. And what you change the name from Greenland to Trumpland, and you try to figure out some way that you can show him that he's actually changed the map and increased U.S. power and sovereignty over the Western Hemisphere. And I think that's the starting point. That's how the Europeans are thinking about it. We don't exactly know what Trump wants here. I don't think it's the minerals. The minerals are difficult to exploit, and it's likely to be many, many years before they come online in a way that actually increases U.S. self-reliance when it comes to minerals and reduces their reliance on China. So I don't think the minerals are going to be enough here. I think you have to do something that shows an increased U.S. presence and more ability to project power into Greenland. That could be some kind of leasing arrangement where the U.S. gets to claim some limited sovereignty over some part of Greenland, even though the Greenlandic people remain citizens of Denmark. But again, we don't really know what Trump wants here. And I think that's a huge challenge that's going to have to be unpacked, probably starting now in Davos and over the next few weeks.
Yeah, John, and I'd just like to focus on Davos for a bit. The U.S., Trump's presence at WEF, it is a record-sized delegation. And then Howard Lutnick wrote a piece for the FT saying that the U.S.'s presence in Davos is a confrontation of the status quo, not a participation, if you will. I mean, how you view the U.S.'s presence in such forums now? I mean, how is this rhetoric likely to be received by other leaders, especially, of course, with the issues like Greenland, trade, NATO as well, top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, calling this a confrontation is a nice way of justifying the ski trip that you're all taking with your other populist buddies from the United States. And so I think I think that's a good spin to put on this. Trump, I think, is clearly more comfortable in these environments, causing major problems for other countries than he was in his first term. He's setting the agenda that even seemed in ways that seemed unthinkable in his first term. And it is true that he is confronting all these status quo powers in Davos and is using the platform in order to really shake things up. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, gave a really powerful speech today from Davos describing how Canada and other middle powers would have to respond to this new world order where, basically the powerful and mighty sort of do what they want and everybody else has to kind of go along with it. And Carney's trying to describe a world where you can still band together in collective action and do something about the major powers that are going to be aggressive and belligerent, powers that used to include countries like Russia, China, to a lesser degree, Iran. And now, sadly, for the Europeans and for the Canadians, has to include the United States. So this is a very confrontational U.S. delegation going to Davos. I'm very curious to see what Trump will say tomorrow that's going to go beyond the existing rhetoric that he's already used. And I think that this is going to, and I'm also curious what happens behind the scenes.
Yeah, and just, to add on that, it seems like in the past WEFs, the focus is always on de-risking from China. And now it seems like it's about de-risking from the U.S. I wonder what this moment, means to you, especially also, Canada's PM, Mark Carney, he kind of broke from Washington to slash tariffs on Chinese EVs in exchange for those agricultural concessions. I mean, does it seem to you that the U.S.'s allies are opting for the predictability of the Chinese over the volatility seen with the Americans?
I think there's some element here where they're looking for any port in a storm, and the Chinese are willing to, I think at least with the Chinese, they kind of know what they're going to get because they know that the transactional nature of the Chinese is driven by their own domestic stability reasons and and they know the threats that come along with it. They know the Chinese have a history of dumping goods into their markets. They know the Chinese don't always hold up to their obligations but they can kind of plan around that. With the Americans now, the rules are totally changed. I mean, you've got this defense sector that's built around American technology that is currently providing a shield over all of Europe and all of Canada. Well, what if America's not the ally that you thought it was? And I think that's going to affect sales of American military equipment into Europe and Canada. It's going to create a lot more urgency about diversifying away from potential coercion of America using that supply chain in order to undermine your own national security. And the implications of this are very profound across a number of tech sectors. One European country was advising that its citizens not use Apple AirPods, because they were worried about security vulnerabilities that the Americans could potentially take advantage of. So commercially, the implications here are very profound and very broad, given how deeply integrated the U.S. tech stack is across all of these formerly allied countries.
Okay, Jon, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for your time and your insight this morning. Jon Lieber, Managing Director at Eurasia Group.